So we will start our program today. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Elvira Basevich. Elvira Basevich is assistant professor of philosophy at the University of California, Davis, and also the Lawrence S. Rockefeller visiting faculty fellow at Princeton University, Center for Human Values. And her research areas are social and political philosophy, Africana philosophy, and late modern German philosophy, especially Kant, Hegel, and Marx. So it's a perfect fit for our conference today. And she's also a co-organizer of an online lecture series, Philosophy in Times of Crisis, together with Henny Blom and Ansgar Lisi. I will just mention a few of her several publications. She published a book in 2020 called W.E.B. Du Bois, The Lost and the Found, and the paper Reckoning with Kant on Race, published in the Philosophical Forum, also in 2020. So it's a great pleasure to have you here with us today, Elvira, and please go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be here. So I'll launch right into it. In the book he published before his untimely death, Black Rights, White Wrongs, Charles W. Mills develops what he calls a Black radical Kantianism, defending the egalitarian promise of Kant's republicanism for theorizing racial justice. In his view, an imminent critique of Kant's practical philosophy must appeal to universal moral and political principles to render public institutions just and inclusive. Now, the question that I want to take up my time here is, how should theorists go about exactly transforming Kantian discourse on justice to advance a substantive theory of justice? In this talk, I'm going to assess what it would mean to undertake such a transformation of Kantian discourse on justice in the light of the plight of freedmen and their descendants in the Reconstruction era in the United States. In his writing on Reconstruction, W.E.B. Du Bois was plagued by the idea of a meaningless emancipation for Black freedmen and their descendants. The passage of the Reconstruction Amendments legally abolished slavery and gave Blacks de jure rights and the nominal protections of U.S. citizenship. But Du Bois warned that, quote, a second slavery would take the place of the first being Black chattel slavery, if we don't have the structural reorganization of dependent labor relations. So I'm going to propose that the project of a Black radical Kantianism should really invite philosophers to use Kant's system of right to map concrete obstacles to the implementation of justice, and to rethink with Kant the normative basis of an anti-racist political critique. And I'm going to build on Mills's Kantian project by using Du Bois's concept of second slavery in the Reconstruction era as really a kind of litmus test to develop a Kantian system of right. I argued that the concept of second slavery poses a theoretical challenge to Black radical Kantian political theory. To wit, that concept of second slavery challenges Kant's system of right to diagnose the obstacles to the advance of justice and to propose concrete solutions in an intersectional political economy. So that's the framework that I'm using. One might ask, why Kant at all? Maybe, and some have made this accusation against Mills, that turning to Kant is misguided, that Mills himself was misguided on this point, as I am in tracing a link from Du Bois to Kant via Mills's critique of Kant. So let's try to be clear here on why exactly Kant can be helpful. I'm going to begin with the suggestion that Kant can help us map the concrete, historically specific obstacles to justice. On this view, the theoretical value of Kant's practical philosophy is diagnostic. By the term diagnostic, I follow Lea Upi to mean that a theory provides a helpful description of a social conflict that challenges theorists to clarify, or as the case may be, redefine a requirement of justice. But can it be that Kant unwittingly diagnoses the obstacles to demands of justice posed by white supremacy? In her fabulous new book, Kant's Theory of Labor, Jordan Pascoe argues precisely and persuasively for this point. Her innovative discussion of American Reconstruction shows that somehow, in spite of himself, Kant is peculiarly well-suited for diagnosing dependent labor relations in the post-bellum intersectional political economy in the US. According to Pascoe, Kant's formulation of domestic right in particular appears to give a legitimate juridical form to the permanent dependence of Black freedmen and their descendants on white capital. Domestic right provides public sanction to the notion of a right to a person akin to the right of a thing, and that we have in Kant's final and decisive rejection of rightful slavery, a careful defense of enclosed dependent labor. So that the enclosed dependence of Black laborers in the post-bellum US resembles at the structural level that of domestic right. So the abolition of slavery makes use of the juridical structure of domestic right to create, in the case of Black freedmen, a quote, new category of laborers who are meant to sink into enclosed dependence. And the emancipation of free labor thus begins an era of second slavery. The powerful idea of enclosed dependence, like that of Du Bois's concept of second slavery, illustrates that a denigrating system of social values and practices, typically characteristic of domestic right and buttressed by a constitutional republic, comes to influence the development of contract and property right in capitalist civil society. The idea of domestic right is new precisely because it's not an outgrowth of economic inequality per se, but it's a system of social values and practices that organize unequal social relations that in turn come to shape economic realities. And so what we have with the idea of second slavery is what some political scientists have described as a domestication or quote feminization of Black labor, in the specific sense that its value, whether we're talking about exchange value or perceived social and cultural value, is denigrated, such that the value of Black labor is perpetually diminished and disrespected in the same fashion that a household denigrates the domestic labor of wives and servants. Just as marriage is posed as the rightful alternative to sex work, it is domestic labor that is marked as slavery's other rather than contract labor. Hence, Black freedmen are locked in enclosed dependencies as if they were dependent on the household of the Republic. However, as Du Bois makes clear, ex-slaves were not, quote, wards of the state. Rather, as emancipated wage laborers, they were coerced into private dependence on white-controlled capital. The holdover of a slaveocracy to possess Black people as chattel property informs whites' reluctance to pay Blacks a wage, afford meaningful employment opportunities, or give public space for their interests inside and outside the workplace. So much for the diagnostic value of Kant's system. On my estimation, it appears to be largely negative in that the idea of domestic right is really pinpointing obstacles to the advance of justice. But I want to raise this further claim can Kant's system offer anything positive by way of substantively theorizing freedom for ex-slaves? And I want to suggest how Kant might do that. So apart from its diagnostic value, what's the prescriptive value? According to Du Bois, a meaningful emancipation should aim to complete the unfinished of abolishing slavery, and in our time to abolish second slavery, which he thinks the US as a republic has never completed. In a Kantian register, Du Bois's critique of Reconstruction affirms that slaves have an innate right to freedom and should have been embedded into a new juridical and cosmopolitan order. But is a Kantian ideal of universal civil independence of labor also well suited to abolish enclosed dependencies, just as the concept of domestic right is well suited to diagnose obstacles to justice? So I'm going to suggest, following Mills, that it is, and say a little bit about how. Mills took a lot of heat for his positive Kantian commitments later in life. He explicitly asserts that the ideal as normative dimension of Kant's republicanism is, quote, very attractive. So I'm going to quote Mills here. He writes, "The key principles and ideals of Kant's ethical political thought are very attractive. The respect for the rights of individual persons, the ideal of the Rechtsstaat, admittedly somewhat modified from Kant's own version, and the vision of a global cosmopolitan order of equals," end quote. The upshot of Black radical Kantianism is that this ideal of public right appears to be its normative foundation, right? Kant conceives of persons as innately free. The idea of innate freedom is then, as we know the story well, is the normative basis for the social recognition that mediates the acquisition of rights and political liberties. The idea then of the joint realization of the power of choice emerges the kind of normative baseline for a critique of an intersectional political economy. And there's a lot of sort of new exciting work exploring this dimension of this more radical dimension of Kant's political thought. But if freedom is the cat's meow, then it's not clear to me that Kant is the only game in town here for thinking on concrete, historically specific terms how exactly we should understand freedom. For the remainder of my talk, I'm going to develop Du Bois's neglected notion of second slavery in the American Reconstruction era to theorize the requirements of justice grounded in a notion of freedom. Like Kant, Du Bois theorized justice in terms of the institutional conditions for the realization of choice. But unlike Kant, he defended the economic independence of Black laborers to achieve a universal ideal of civil independence. Du Bois' test case was the civic enfranchisement of former slaves and their descendants in the Americas as a class. And for him, freedom is a sham if it cannot render emancipated Black laborers truly free. So I'm going to say a little bit about how we ought to understand the concept of second slavery. There's much that one can gather from a Du Boisian worry that de jure emancipation is meaningless due to second slavery, or that it begins an incomplete process that's still ongoing of emancipation. So allow me to paint in broad strokes what he means and does not mean by this provocative statement. First, I'm going to draw a contrast between the exploitation of slave labor and, quote, wage slavery. Du Bois, with his predecessor, Frederick Douglass, wonders what it meant to, quote, own a person, body and soul. One might suppose in a Marxist key that to own a person is to own the productive and reproductive capacities of their physical bodies. Slave would be capital and slave labor a means to accumulate capital. Marx evaluates slavery strictly in terms of the functional capacity of a system of production to extract labor power. And as we see, his analysis of racial segregation, to the extent that it appears at all, is really limited to labor markets, and it's thus the same as that of free labor markets in general. Namely, it entails the exploitation of labor by capital. Like Marx, Du Bois distinguishes between the liberty to sell one's labor power as a commodity for a price from actual liberty. And notwithstanding the Emancipation Proclamation that they were, quote, henceforth and forever free, ex-slaves were left dependent on whites. White elites controlled essential productive assets in agriculture in the South and in industry in the North. And really, freedmen had no choice but to sell their labor power on the market for subsistence. Du Bois thus regards slavery as a system of dependent labor relations that survived the extension of civil and political rights. Ergo, a second slavery emerges. So prima facie, it appears that Marx's critique of exploitation captures the nature of dependent labor relations that degrade Black liberty in the postbellum era. For Marx, a laborer is, quote, as Marx's language, is a slave to a wage. And by selling one's labor power for a price, laborers are, as a class, quote, enslaved to capital. And Marx argues that actually enslaved persons were treated as mere productive equipment, so that he likens a slave to a cotton spinning machine, except that a slave is an actual person. So I'm going to quote Marx here. What is a slave? A man of the Black race. The one explanation is worthy of the other. A Black man is a Black man. Only under certain conditions does he become a slave. A cotton spinning machine is a machine for spinning cotton. Only under certain conditions does it become capital. I will grant that Du Bois appears sympathetic to Marx's contention that Black chattel slavery built the wealth of American and Anglo-European nations. Like Marx, Du Bois highlights that slave labor is highly exploited. It is exploitative in that the owner of capital, in this case, both the owner of human beings and of land and productive assets, materially benefits from slave labor. And he grants that Black chattel slavery and, quote, wage slavery appear to align in terms of the underlying structural dependence that characterizes labor's highly exploitative relation to capital. The wage earner and the enslaved, they're both capital, and in being capital, that is a commodity sold for profit, and their exploitation facilitates the purchaser's further accumulation of capital. So here we have a standard Marxist functional analysis of the relation between labor and capital. And yet, I want to push back here. Du Bois has serious misgivings about the idea of, quote, wage slavery as describing dependent labor relations in the postbellum US Republic. In fact, I want to suggest that he's deliberately developing this alternative formulation, that of second slavery, to try to displace this kind of sloganism, precisely because it's failing to understand economic realities as informed by a slaveocracy in the Republic and at this moment. And it's betraying a kind of chauvinist moral sensibility that's not really fully appreciating the moral injury sustained by Black freedmen and their descendants and those who had experienced slavery. So Du Bois coins the term second slavery in a socio-historical context, in which he was no doubt aware that white laborers were popularizing this slogan of end wage slavery. The idea of wage slavery, however, first off, it didn't represent economic realities accurately, even if we're taking on this strictly functional analysis that Marxist critique of exploitation suggests. In fact, its popular usage tended to ignore actual Black chattel slavery as a problem for labor rights organizing. Du Bois writes that the American labor movement said, quote, almost nothing almost nothing of the greatest revolution in labor that had happened in America for 100 years, the emancipation of slaves, end quote. Instead, Du Bois observes that white laborers tended to regard themselves, they regarded themselves as, quote, the true slaves to capital, as if it was primarily their economic exploitation that had built empires. Obviously, in the context of Black chattel slavery, colonialism, neocolonialism, at best, this is marginally true at the level of strict economic analysis. Slaves and colonized subjects were the hyper-exploited labor force that shored up white capital in Europe and the Americas. And given this self-indulgent short-sightedness, white laborers failed to understand the economic realities of the Reconstruction intersectional political economy. I mean, they regarded Blacks as a threat to their jobs, security, not as potential comrades in arms in desperate need of solidarity and support. Freedmen were competition, not potential civic fellows with whom they could work together to lead a labor movement. Further, Marx's characterization of exploitation doesn't fully capture the racial dynamics embedded in the hyper-exploitation of Black freedmen. So I want to argue here that a theory of exploitation alone cannot capture the nature of second slavery. There is something about the aspiration to own Black souls before and after emancipation that imbues in it a particularly malignant character to postbellum racial domination. Of course, there's a voluminous literature in Africana and moral philosophy that tries to sort of pick apart the nature of a moral injury that characterizes whites' desire to possess Black souls. So allow me to observe that the impulse manifests in a Kantian register anti-Black disrespect. So there's a form of racial disrespect that whites do not experience, however poor and exploited their labor may also be. On the contrary, whites are sources of this kind of disrespect, of anti-Black disrespect, as evident in their historical failure to align their interests with slaves and former slaves. And it's whites' lack of respect for Black freedmen that undermined interracial labor solidarity that would have made substantive improvements for all laborers. And so what I want to suggest here is that white labor union organizers, and this is following Du Boisian critique, they really betrayed a white supremacist sensibility that not only ignored the historical fact of slavery, but they really positioned themselves as the true slaves, as if they ended up being the victims, as the true victims of the Southern slaveocracy. And this is something deeper than just misunderstanding economic realities. At bottom, this is just displaying an anti-Black racist disrespect. So at this moment, I want to sort of fill out the character, the normative character of the concept of second slavery by bringing in Kantian insights to flesh out the nature of disrespect that I don't think that a functional theory of exploitation alone is going to give us, precisely because what a Kantian system is going to give us is this notion of the innate moral value of persons as free that's supposed to anchor a critique and make sense of how other groups deviate in their behavior and judgment from this standard. And I think this is going to be really important to trying to build together an apparatus, a conceptual apparatus that teases apart what's normatively at stake in understanding second slavery and ultimately in abolishing it. So Kant argues that using a person as a mere means fails to respect their capacity for choice. It takes it away. One can then infer that every exploitive labor relation disrespects a laborer's capacity for choice. But not every exploitive labor relation evinces racist disrespect that takes away another's power of choice on account of their race. Anti-Black disrespect doesn't merely consist in the failure to respect a person's power of choice. It assumes they don't have any effective power of choice that one can fail or succeed in respecting. Notions of racial inferiority assume that the very capacity for choice hasn't been freely realizable among non-white groups. Instead, as I've explained already, whites aspire to own what's left of the metaphysical residue, so to speak, of Blacks' power of choice as an outgrowth of a deformed human nature for whites to manipulate, absorb, humiliate, or entertain themselves with. This is part of what it means to, quote, own a Black soul. So by way of clarifying the role of anti-Black disrespect in the socio-historical context of second slavery, let's draw a fuller contrast between the exploitation of slave labor and that of white labor. Anti-Black disrespect captures the marked differences between wage slavery and Black chattel slavery. Though a slave is bought on the market, their labor power is not. Slave labor does not have time constraints. Servitude only ends in death, and it's congenital, a condition that's passed down from generation to generation, marked as, quote, Black. A capitalist does not buy the enslaved person's labor power for a price. They buy the person and their future progeny, body and soul. Enslavers aspire to buy another's capacity for labor and their power of choice as a practical agent. So that no matter how degraded the factory hand is, writes Du Bois, he is not real estate. Anti-Black disrespect is thus integral in shaping the overall character of the exploitation of laborers in the Reconstruction era. And it's an essential piece of Du Bois's idea of second slavery in that it shows in a Kantian register the denigration of the unconditional moral value of Black rational humanity. So in the time that I have left, I'm going to say a couple of things about how to flesh out how the nature of anti-Black disrespect as it manifests in this phenomena of second slavery and sort of tracking the specific labor conditions that result. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about briefly is the use of violence and how that's a peculiar malignant feature of second slavery. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the wasting away of persons as another one of these peculiar features, again, that evinces a racist disrespect that white laborers, no matter sort of how poorly off they might be, aren't necessarily exposed to. So the use of violence. The system of slavery relied on physical coercion and outright violence. Slavers treat violence as an indispensable catalyst to goad Black bodies into laboring and reproductive activities. Coercive measures were meant to, quote, rouse free Black laborers from a natural indolence. And this is a holdover from slavery's system of anti-Black social values and practices. African and Afro-descendant persons are regarded as inherently lazy and incapable of self-direction in their capacity as productive and reproductive laborers. Slavery institutionalized sexual violence, institutionalized it against Black women and girls, whom Du Bois describes as, quote, mere brooding mares under this condition. And a perverse feature of Black structural dependence on white capital in the postbellum era is that Black women were overwhelmingly driven into domestic service. There, they endured the continuation of a legacy of subservience to the emotional needs of white households at the cost of being unavailable for their own children, as well as often suffering sustained sexual abuse at the hands of white employers nostalgic about white sexual license on slave plantations. So whereas the labor market coerces the buying and selling of labor power, slavers physically brutalized enslaved bodies through direct coercion. The anti-Black disrespect that is at the core of second slavery thus consists in this physically coercive and violent labor practice. And that's what persisted, or we see it persisting in the Reconstruction era. For example, Du Bois notes that after the failure of Reconstruction, Black code legislation in Southern states, it reinscribed the physical coercion of Black bodies by outright kidnapping laborers who had quit their jobs, dragging them back to places of, quote, private employment, incarcerating them in prisons, or where they were enslaved in chain gangs in collusion with government and local private interests. The Black codes, we could then plausibly say, were thus a vestige of slavery, or slavery by another name. So reflecting on labor conditions of the early 20th century, Du Bois concludes that we could look out into the organization of the political economy now and identify a structural location to assess which groups of laborers are still subject to outright physical coercion, direct coercion in the organization of labor practices. And here, and this is part of the spirit of his Pan-Africanism, he's going to draw continuation with the experiences of Black freedmen and their descendants, and those who are subject to colonialism, specifically those who are forced to extract labor resources under physical duress, as being akin to second slavery. And so we see him sort of expanding his analysis to identify the conditions of labor rather than direct descent from slaves. And I think this is very interesting to see sort of him fleshing out this concept for it to be sufficiently copious to attend to these kind of really nasty labor practices that are continuing into the 20th century. And obviously they still continue to this day. So there's so much for the physical use for violence. I want to say a little bit more about what it means for labor to, quote, waste away. And this suggests another sort of marked difference from just a theory of exploitation. So the price of the labor power of emancipated Blacks in the Reconstruction era was insufficient for subsistence. And I'm going to argue that it introduced a new logic for the compensation of Black wage laborers in general, where the price of their labor power was so low that it was consistent with a body physically wasting away. Indeed, and going back to Pascoe, she notes that Kant had complained. So Kant's original complaints with slavery is that it, quote, wastes away the enslaved. The upshot is that in a postbellum political economy, the wage contract of an emancipated slave doesn't aim to exploit them by setting a living wage, that is, a wage sufficient for subsistence. Rather, the setting of the price of labor, the wage, was never supposed to be enough to survive and ward off death. This I find very interesting. So here we can see that the notion that the price of labor should be set by the cost of the maintenance of a laborer's physical body, in fact, it betrays an evaluative commitment to preserving life that simply did not extend to Black and brown laborers, though it did tend to extend to white laborers. After all, the notion that free Blacks may exist in the polity or in the world at all was contested in the postbellum US. In fact, Du Bois notes that few expected that Blacks would survive, much less flourish, as a free people. Pseudoscientific theories projected models of how they'd eventually die out as a subset of the human race. In any case, freedmen's low wages emerged as a kind of new minimum for leveling down the wages of the whole working class. All this supports the Marxist analysis that racial segregation in labor markets functions to bolster capital accumulation, but it also suggests that there's something else going on in the form of racist disrespect that characterizes second slavery. Thank you so much.
Great. So if you have questions, please raise your hands if you're online. So just use the raise hand function, and if you're in the room, raise your physical hands. And we have questions, Stefan.
Thank you. Can you hear me over there? Okay, good. So I have a question sort of about Marx and Kant, not so much about Bois. I like your analysis a lot. But I took it that the reflection on Du Bois was meant to sort of give a more Kantian versus a Marxian interpretation. And I understood that sort of the distinction you were making was that Marx's analysis of exploitation is in terms of sort of materialist condition of labor time, and Kant was sort of prohibiting sort of a deeper exploitation of the person. And so I just wanted to ask about the early Marx who thinks that the material conditions, of course, are ultimately led back down to sort of the final level of alienation, which is the alienation of man to man. And I took that to be always a very Kantian position in the early Marx of it.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely point. I find Marx's early work in the Paris manuscripts often to be my favorite part of Marx, and one that's most conducive to this more richer analysis of what's left out of a theory of exploitation in a way that I think the later Marx himself wasn't very sensitive to, and to the loss of Marxist critique. But I will say this, that the notion of alienation in Africana philosophy, and particularly in Du Bois, takes on an entire different conceptual form than that of the issue of sort of moral devaluation. So that is to say, yes, and like we need, I still want to hold on to this Kantian sliver of what it means to respect persons as innately free and make room for a conceptual apparatus that's tied to the early Marx and notions of alienation in particular. Though for Du Bois, how that's going to play out is going to really put us in a completely different direction away from Marx, and locate us within a discussion about the social recognition of one's person as belonging to a social group. So here Du Bois is going to develop a view of double consciousness as really being constitutive element of undoing structural injustice, which I really love. But you're right that this is just, there's so much more to say about how Marx fits in here and where he doesn't, and where he can help and where he can't.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have two somewhat related questions. The first one is about the status of non-Black indentured servants in the colonial and post-colonial United States. And in particular, if you don't consider them individually, but as ethnic groups, let's say the Irish, and look at the kind of discrimination that they receive, not just in terms of their economic status or individually for other circumstances on personal grounds, but as a group ethnically defined, not by skin color, but by religion, for example, Catholic as opposed to Protestant in any of the varieties. So how would you position those between second slavery on the Black side and the organized workforce, industrial workforce on the other side? And the second question, somewhat related, Kant too has a legal category in his philosophy of right for, you might say, commodified work, applying especially to domestics, under the category in German auf dingliche Art persönliches Recht, a personal right that yet reifies, in that sense, Marxian commodifies. So the upshot of that is that these people do not enjoy active citizenship. They are not involved in any form of self-governance or civic responsibilities. So how we treat those in an array of social political distinction that might include slaves as well as these servants and any kind of menial labor. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm going to start with the second question. So I have new work coming out now. I believe it's in the Kantian Review that takes up the issue of passive citizenship as a linchpin for how we ought to reconceive a Kantian ideal of civic equality. So I want to start from a place where we diagnose passive citizenship as indicative of structural inequality that ought to be the site for contestation and reform in order to realize a Kantian requirement of justice. So notwithstanding Kant's own vision of what the system of public right should look like, that he really just gets it wrong to say that sort of encased within a legitimate state, we could have the proliferation of these kinds of structural dependencies as if they're consistent with right. I think that's just a mistake. And I want to do more than what, to say that as a matter of textual exegesis, this seems to be a peculiarity of the thesis. I want to say something like, if Kant is going to be helpful for theorizing freedom, we really need to take seriously why he's rationalizing structural independence for a certain class of laborers, and how then we could sort of pull apart an ideal of freedom to condemn precisely what he failed to condemn, which I take to be in the spirit of a sort of Black radical critique of Kant, so that you're taking Kant as a guiding star, but you're not sticking to the letter of what he said, but to the spirit. The issue of indentured slavers and the indentured white servants in the early Americas, of course, I mean,
through the 19th century.
So this 19th century, when are we talking?
Any kind of servants that are hired from Ireland and come on conditions of having so and so many years of work to do because their passage is paid by the white employer. Yeah,
so I think we have to be very careful about the historical period we're discussing. So my account is located in the Reconstruction era and its aftermath. So we're talking about the end of the Civil War in the US and the United States trying to grapple with what it means to abolish a slave-based constitution, so that you have the passing of the Reconstruction amendments. What this means is that we've had, at this point in the United States, a host of legal precedents that are supposed to define what it means juridically to belong to a certain racial group on the one hand, and the forms of highly racialized exploitative labor practices that are going to be sort of encased within that kind of racial juridical understanding. This took a really long time to set in. So there are periods earlier in colonial Americas where there's a lot more confusion, discontinuity in sort of racial understanding. So it was a much more of a mixed bag, such that when we get to the period that I'm describing, what had been confusing is no longer confusing. People have a very strong sense, so to speak, of where they stand in this contrived racial hierarchy, in part because there's been this incredible juridical precedent set in the Constitution of the United States. But your point is so important because, and this is slightly different from the issue of sort of ethnic difference in indentured servants in the early Americas, but it's really the place of where do poor whites fit into a category of second slavery. And Du Bois is really trying to find a place for them that I find it's so peculiar and interesting in that he thinks that they're an essential part of this picture, because for him, the system of slavery and the system of second slavery doesn't work if you don't have white buy-in. especially at the level of poor middle-class whites. And part of his critique of the American labor movement is that they had a blunted moral sensibility, that they kept describing themselves, to the extent that they were radical labor organizers at all, that they were the truly exploited. And they did not really expand the scope of their moral imagination, and again, in a Kantian register, to recognize the moral injury that their comrades in arms, so to speak, were suffering. So in that sense, without this kind of inflated sense of self as white that ended up really taking root in the Americas and continues to this day, the phenomenon of second slavery, I mean, slavery itself, it wouldn't have happened. And Du Bois wants to start sort of picking apart these racialized understandings of prepossession to political power and economic power that not only doomed the labor movement in the US, but really created the conditions for the Jim Crow era.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we have a final question from Daniel James.
Yeah, wait a minute, can you see me here? Thanks, this is a really great talk. I enjoyed a lot, still thinking about a lot of things. One thing I'd just be curious, and just for strategic purposes, with the question, I want to put back on one point concerning the limits of the concept of exploitation when it comes to analyzing second slavery. I found everything what you said very compelling and convincing. I was wondering whether thinking of second slavery in terms of what some people like independence theorists are called overexploitation might be helpful. Can you hear me?
I'm sorry, I missed that, Daniel.
Maybe I'll turn on my.
No. Yeah, you have to do that.
Maybe I'll just speak. The mic is there, right?
The mic, yeah. If you speak from this computer, she will hear very well. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to take up more time. Can you hear me better here?
Yes, much better.
Excellent. Okay. So I was wondering if it could be helpful to think of second slavery in terms of what some people in the context of dependency theory and some anti-colonial Marxists have sort of drawing on Marx have called overexploitation. So I mean, a lot of what you discussed under the label of the waste of labor, for instance, fits with some of Marx's own discussion when he thinks of the length of the Labor Day, and that sometimes there were no legal restraints. So you found a lot of exploitation that went beyond what would have been rational to some regard. And I think some, both like materialist theorists of racism, but also some dependency theorists have sort of drawn on these ideas and elaborated them into a theory of what they then called overexploitation. And I was just wondering how well that would maybe resonate with some of your discussion. I get the whole disrespect angle. I can see that that clearly adds something to the analysis. But yeah, I was just wondering if that could be a great way. That could be a way to maybe still bring the two accounts a bit closer together.
Yay! Thank you. Thanks so much for the question and comment. Absolutely, it's compatible with a conception of overexploitation and hyperexploitation. In fact, one can say that, Elvira, all you've done is to show here are some of the underlying evaluative practices that make possible hyperexploitation, or in domestic and colonial cosmopolitan contexts. But I want to push back a little bit against this, not really push back, but try to go further into this non-functional territory to map the kind of moral grounds that we need to map to kind of make sense of the way that white supremacist ideology is absurd. That it's not profit motive or the extraction of labor power, it's always there, but sometimes it's just about exerting a dominating will. Sometimes it's just about reinscribing a racial hierarchy and defining what that is, even if you lose profit. like you lose money, or you're not extracting labor in any straightforward sense. So in the fuller version of this talk, I talk about the philosopher of immigration, Jose Mendoza's critique of migrant detention camps at the US-Mexico border, and the way that migrant workers are kind of funneled through these prison-like camps under freezing conditions, such that migrant workers refer to them as, quote, ice boxes. And it's not clear through this process how exactly labor is being exploited. And I mean, clearly it's connected to an economy that's driven by starvation wages. But through the mere apparatus of how a particular migrant is engaging with the state and spending weeks, sometimes years, being funneled through this process, there seems to be something like a profoundly irrational and cruel assertion just of white supremacist power. That's what is it supposed to communicate if your baby dies, a 2-month-old dies from pneumonia, from being stuck in this camp, except to say where one belongs in a racial hierarchy, right? And that isn't even to say that one isn't welcome, right? It's like there is a sense in which there's a place carved out in an intersectional political economy that's still designed for the hyper exploitation of one's labor. But there are all these other peculiarly malignant features that are they're tracking racial standing. And that's part of what I think the concept of second slavery is meant to show. And it's not reducible to profit in any straightforward way, although it's always compatible with it. And that's sort of what the kind of normative space I'm trying to mark out here.
Yeah, that was very